Hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Hazardous Webinar series, where we take a closer look at one of the Natural Hazard Research Australia research projects, its findings, and how it will be translated into practice with members of the project team and the people who will use the research. My name is Rowena Morris, and I'm one of the Node research managers with the Centre, and I'm based in the Sydney office. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are all gathered from a range of different Aboriginal lands today. I'm on the Darrell lands at the base of Mount Gira, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we live and work and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to recognise that these lands and waters have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a link along with any presentation materials will be shared in the coming weeks. Please let us know if you have any technical problems by adding the details to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our team will help troubleshoot any issues. Questions will be answered at the end of the formal panel session, so please add your questions to the Q&A function. Make sure you specify who your question is for, and we'll get to them in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So today's webinar will focus on an incredible project where the researchers have gone over and above the project scope to deliver a suite of outputs and outcomes addressing bushfire risk at the rural-urban interface. The webinar will delve into the severity and depth of the rural-urban interface problem. The team will present on the problem, the tools, the methodologies, and the insight. They'll also present on how to apply the findings to protect lives and property. It is my pleasure to introduce today's three panellists. Professor David Bowman is the Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science and the Director of the Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania. He is a lead researcher for the Natural Hazard Research Australia's Bushfire Risk at the Rural-Urban Interface project, and he holds the prestigious Australian Research Council Laureate Fellowship. Professor Bowman has over 40 years of experience and is motivated by a commitment to improving the scientific basis of fire management. Dr. Grant Williamson is a Senior Research Fellow and Deputy Director of the Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania. His research focus is on the geospatial analysis of fire regimes and fire ecology, spanning in scale from analysis of global trends in the fire activity and impacts to landscape scale understanding of fire regimes and local scale risk reduction on the urban wildland interface. And we also have Melissa O'Halloran from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and she is the Manager of Bushfire Risk Planning. She leads the team using fire behaviour and impact modelling to support local bushfire management committees with the rollout of the next generation of bushfire risk management plans. She works closely with the research community to implement research findings to improve the understanding and policy for bushfire risk and community resilience. Now, they've got an amazing team behind them. They're brilliant presenters. So I'd love to hand over to David, Grant, and Melissa to listen to their presentations. Thank you. Over to you, Dave.
So at the very outset, I'd like to acknowledge the huge team effort that is underpinning this work. And I've put QR codes for the publication, so you'll be able to see the individual outputs that we've already got, and that for the particular team. So, a very fulsome acknowledgement for a fantastic group of people who've made this a really successful and fun project. Very quickly, what I'm going to talk about, just a very brief explanation that we do have a global fire crisis, and that the wildland-urban interface or rural-urban interface is really the theatre of operations of where this crisis is playing out. I'm going to describe the way we approached this project, breaking down a very, very complicated problem into three big chunks, and then within those big chunks, some smaller, more tractable research elements. But right throughout, the research is focused on being outcome orientated, and that culminates in the production of at least 4 hazard notes, which are plain English summaries of the research. So yeah, the take home message is I think, which really just leaves nothing to be discussed. It's a paper that we published last year in Science, analysing the reinsurer Munich Re, one of the most important reinsurers in the world. And what we can see is around the year 2010, 2015, an uptick in major fire disasters, billion-dollar events, loss of life, total impact relativised to GDP. As I say, there's really no further correspondence needs to be entered into. We are now inside a global fire crisis. The insurers understand this, the reinsurers understand it, the agencies understand it. The question is, what are we going to do about it? What you need when you confront a problem like something as existential as a global fire crisis is you need a vision. And so what I've been doing in the background in this paper in Science, where I was trying to sort of think through what a sustainable interface would look like. How would it work? So I think it's very important to always have a vision, some point. But the problem with visions and some, point of focus, something that you can aspire to, is how do you get there? And that's where, this project has been so useful, because we've been able to break apart that vision rather than just an empty promise, break apart that vision and try to find a way where we can make tractable, actionable, useful steps to achieving sustainability, because we are going to achieve sustainability. That's non-negotiable. With wildfire, we have to. We can't be defeatist. We are going to solve this problem. It's a matter of how quickly we do it and how much pain we experience in doing it, but we are going to solve it. So what we did with the project is basically we have these three core elements, which are the geospatial, the biophysical, and the social. So that's the sort of the organising principle. You can't think about the interface of where bushfires are occurring without thinking about the geographic, the biophysical, and the social factors that interact. Now, they're big ideas. So what we did is that we broke down those three elements into another three elements. We looked at New South Wales house loss patterns. We compared house loss in Australia to the United States. We looked at the 1967 house loss patterns, Hobart, the most notorious and, as far as I understand, the most significant fire disaster still financially in relativised terms. We looked at fuel management options. We looked at garden fire hazards. We looked at live fuel flammability. And then we looked at, on the social side, attitudes towards fuel management, perceptions of risk, and evacuation intentions. And then what we did is that we took all of the things we learned from those specific research, and then we distilled them into some tools, which Grant will describe: house loss hazard mapping, LiDAR assessment of gardens, expert assessment of gardens, and some policy framing on the social parameters. So I'm very quickly going to go through the research findings, and then Grant will lead into how those led to some tools and policy framing. With the geospatial analysis, what we've found are some good news and some bad news. The good news is that the standard 100-metre rule, as we like to call it, is quite a good planning instrument for mapping fire hazard around flammable vegetation. The but is it doesn't work, and that's that black line in the slide. it doesn't work. The distance, the likelihood of house loss increases substantially up to almost a kilometre under catastrophic fire weather. The other bad news is that urban conflagrations, such as occurred in LA, we believe are theoretically possible in Australia. And we have a conceptual model to explain that. And you can see that in the QR code. That's looking at it from the landscape scale. One of the factors that we've realised is very important is defendable space, and that's gardens. Gardens, we did a review of the global literature, which we were able to, capture. And basically, the three elements that are very important: risk factors, direct flame contact, radiant heat, and firebrands. And that what we've realised is that, yes, there is BAL, but the problem is the gardens may be extremely receptive for the firebrands. And they may be one of the reasons why you can get this long distance house loss, well away from when there would be any radiation. So that then leads into questions about the design of gardens, the variation in flammability between native and exotic plants. But really, the take home we've got is that the zonation is very important, that fuel-free zone that many guidelines around the world stress probably needs to be upregulated here in Australia, around 1 to 2 metres around the house, and that the structure of the garden and the watering of the garden is extremely important. What about mitigating or managing the biophysical threat of the wildfire fuels? I was approached by a forester who was doing thinning to reduce fire hazard in dense regrowth. And there are many areas now in Australia where towns and cities are surrounded by dense regrowth. And I thought, well, that might be a pathway. Commercial logging might be a pathway to reduce hazard. Turns out it's a disaster. It produces so much debris. 75% of the timber is cut waste. This is a huge problem for the forest industry. We've got to do something with this material. We can't just let it sit there, and we shouldn't be burning it and committing that biomass to be greenhouse gases. So thinning theoretically could work, but you've got to crack a very, very difficult nut, and that's what are you going to do with the debris? What we also found is that prescribed burning has a limited effect, less than 10 years. But it's a very complex issue, prescribed burning. It really depends on the vegetation type. It depends the way it affects the shrubs. It depends on really the productivity of the site. We also found, which is interesting, that if you allow some areas to escape being burnt frequently, you may get decreases in flammability of litter and live shoots, but that's offset by increasing biomass of dead fuel. So there are some very, very complex trade-offs that we need to think through. And the answer probably is going to lie with some mix of thinning, mechanical treatment, prescribed burning, but it's going to be customised by forest type. So very much the sorts of fuel treatments around the interface, very much a work in progress, in my opinion. Much more research is required to perfect this. We also delved into the social aspects, and we were considering, really, because of these disasters are centred in this interface, we have a problem that we know from some surveys that 20% of the Tasmanian adults that we surveyed don't intend to leave early. That's quite a sizable chunk. But our longitudinal analysis showed that the risk appetite is changing right across the board between men and women, rural and urban people. And the most, heroic or courageous are the rural men. We also found that there's confusion around last resort and safe place concepts, which are going to affect people's thinking about evacuation. We also found that the fuel treatments that we are canvassing, prescribed burning, cultural burning, mechanical treatment, scale currently to political orientation. So we have to tread carefully because we could exacerbate and unnecessarily politicise an issue which actually there is strong consensus that people want safe interfaces. They want safe interfaces, and they're tremendous support for the idea of cultural burning, which is barely a thing. So really, I think we're at a very delicate stage in negotiating how we articulate and motivate fuel treatments as part of an integrated package to defend suburbs in the rural urban interface. The other thing that we also disclosed is that there's a lot of confusion around the shared responsibility concept, and this is an incredibly important policy challenge. Moving into people's gardens, people are understanding risk at a very complex, multi-scale way. They might be thinking globally around the landscape, their community, their own garden. And there are some really odd sort of paradoxes where people don't really understand the risk of their own garden. They're maybe more freaking out about their neighbour or the landscape. What we found is that delivering personalised reports can increase motivation, but there are a lot of barriers, knowledge gaps, practical constraints, and emotional attachment. So again, in terms of policy, there's real opportunities to dig into how we can better motivate and better facilitate change at the resident scale, and remembering that that's where the firebrands are going to land, and that's an incredibly important opportunity to reduce risk. So I'm going to hand over to Grant. Very, very quick. I mean, ridiculous to summarise 3 years of work in however many minutes. But we're going to then talk about the tools and the policy upshot, which is really the core point of this this presentation. As I said, you've got the QR codes. There is going to be a final report. There are hazard notes. So all of the background material is going to be available if you want to dig deeper into this stuff. So over to Grant.
Great, thanks, David. So I'm going to go through some of the tools and software and guides which we've developed as part of this research program, and I'm going to break those down once again into those three categories of biophysical, geospatial, and in terms of the social section, we're going to talk about some summaries of policy implications for what we found. So for the biophysical component, which was focused in terms of the tools on assessment of the hazard around properties and in gardens, and also bringing into that the issue of plant flammability. I'll give a review of how we did that and some of the practical tools and software we've developed as part of that process to aid in garden assessment. One of the main things we developed is an expert system for assessing hazard around properties in the garden. This was developed following a review of international literature on fire hazard around properties, taking from that review of international literature and connecting the elements which seem to be driving garden hazard across the three zones which David delineated in the earlier slides. A fuel-free zone close to the house, an open zone beyond that, and the tree zone beyond that at varying distances from the property. Within each of those zones, we identified a range of factors driving risk, and we did field assessments on a set of properties in the urban wildland interface around Hobart. And from those assessment hazards we identified, we developed a system which could classify them into an overall risk score within each of those zones and across the garden as a whole. We found a few important things here, and I'm going to stop here to talk briefly about vegetation and flammability as well. The connection across the zones, the presence of paths and barriers, the necessity in particular of having a fuel-free zone close to the house to prevent that direct flame contact, which is something which isn't strongly emphasised in Australian guidelines up to this point, were identified as being really important. Vegetation flammability itself was not necessarily that central as a risk. The watering of the garden was an important factor. Flammability itself, not so much. And we've got some more recent results, which will be coming out soon, looking at flammability, identifying that a more holistic approach, which encompasses all fuel characteristics, the structure of the vegetation, the layout of the vegetation, the presence of paths and barriers in the garden, is more important than strictly the flammability or the live flammability of species. And some flammable plants, including native plants, can be okay in the garden if that is counterbalanced by design strategies in the garden, such as reducing connectivity and cover. We did find when we assessed the gardens that the flammability of the species in the gardens did tend to increase in proximity to native forests. If you were close to bushland, the plants in your garden tended to be more flammable, presumably because of a greater proportion of the native component. But flammability is not the only thing. Now, the important thing about this garden hazard assessment tool is that it is encapsulated in an online system we developed. We used this garden hazard assessment tool, which is a web-based app, in conducting the surveys and the assessments in the gardens. You can go through for each of the categories, for each of our questions. You can answer what you see in the garden. For example, you can look on the left here, is the vegetation well watered? You can give an answer. Are there plants climbing on the wall? You give a number of answers. For each of those answers, depending on what you select, it provides you with advice. That advice is compiled into an overall report for the garden that we can give to the householder to hopefully drive change. It gives a risk category for each of the zones and for the garden as a whole. So it's a rapid assessment of risk in the garden. That's encapsulated in an online tool. It's going to be the basis of some ongoing work we've got through the RACT in Tasmania, expanding that household garden survey process, and that will provide the basis of a study we're doing looking at interventions and incentivisations for homeowners using that survey method we developed. We're also in discussions with the Resilient Building Council in terms of putting a simplified version of this assessment tool in their app, and the process, the expert system model behind this garden assessment is available in R code for people who want to run this on their own data. We've extended this to see how much of these categories we're assessing can actually be detected automatically remotely using LiDAR data. We're very lucky in Tasmania to have some excellent repeated statewide LiDAR surveying being conducted every year at a very high point density. And we've done some work seeing how much we can classify some of those things we surveyed on the ground in gardens automatically. This involves, for each property, extracting first the point outline of the building, building those fuel-free, open and tree zones around that building footprint, breaking the LiDAR point cloud up into those various zones, analysing canopy height and voxelisation of the LiDAR points. And from there, we can automatically derive many of those factors that we were measuring on the ground in the garden survey. So this is just showing here a comparison between, on the left for each of these graphs, the field-based hazard scores we calculated, and on the right, the hazard scores derived from LiDAR variables where they were available. Now, some things we can't directly detect easily with LiDAR. For example, you can tell if a fence is there using LiDAR. you can't tell if it's a wooden fence or a metal fence necessarily, and that's an important factor in garden risk. Metal fences are quite protective, wooden fences are the opposite. So not every variable can be determined by LiDAR, but many of them can. And those that could, if we replace those LiDAR-derived scores into our expert system, we got a very good classification of garden risk comparable to the on-ground scores. So this shows the potential for using this to do broad-scale classifications of garden risk using LiDAR data without necessarily having to visit every property individually, or at the very least, not having to measure as much on the ground at each property. So this, once again, is going to feed into our future work with the RACT, looking at garden hazard across the Hobart rural-urban interface at a household scale. We've also got some ongoing work looking at the recent Dolphin Sands fire on the east coast of Tasmania. There's some example here of post-fire photography, aerial photography of a property, and the fact that we have pre-fire LiDAR of the garden around those properties. This is allowing us to link and do a real test of those hazard calculations we can do from gardens and linking it to property loss. You can see an example here of a burnt structure and an unburnt structure from the Dolphin Sands fire, and we've got the LiDAR data for that, and we'll be hopefully have some interesting results to present from that soon. And that LiDAR processing code to do this garden assessment analysis from LiDAR data is available as R code. So the next element goes to the geospatial side of the project and the house loss hazard mapping. What I'm going to talk through here is the development of a simplified statistical model of firebrand impact or hazard on houses based on vegetation type, fuel load, and fire weather, a radiant heat model which sits alongside that, and the fact that together these comprise a framework which lets us map risk along the rural-urban interface and also test scenarios and see how interventions might change that risk. So it's just some background on the data behind this. For the firebrand or the ember modelling, this was based on physical numerical simulations of firebrand transport run in some software called Fire Dynamic Simulator. What we did was take two landscapes, a more topographically complex one at the top there, and a flat, simpler landscape at the bottom. Using LiDAR data of those two real landscapes, simulated ember production and transport from a fire line in the bushland there. Those simulations were run across a range of different weather conditions, wind speed, forest fire danger index, temperature, a range of different fuel loads, and the path and the landing position of every ember in those simulations was mapped. From all the data from those simulation modelling, we then developed a statistical model to link that maximum ember landing distance, the point at which 95% of embers reached under those conditions, to develop a simple statistical model. This allows us to predict that ember transport distance based on forest fire danger index, fuel load, and landscape slope, flat versus hilly. You can see in the graph on the right there, we were getting much longer ember transport distances in the hilly landscape when the embers were being produced above the target houses. We can see an increase in the ember distance with increasing forest fire danger index, and also an increase in ember distance with fuel load due to the increased intensity of the fire, the number of embers produced. The model behind this is available in an R package. There is a preprint publication about this workout. The second part of this landscape level rural-urban interface hazard model is direct radiant heat. We implemented essentially the same radiant heat model as used in the BOW classification. It's also used by TasFire in developing recommended fuel break widths, which simulates the radiant heat from a fire line based on fuel load and fire weather conditions once again, and then determines the maximum distance a house would have to be from that fire line to be safe from the radiant heat at a BOW 12.5 level. We developed a way to automate this geographically across the landscape by loading in vegetation layers, topographic information, the fire weather you want to test, the location of vegetation and houses, to automatically produce this radiant heat index. Are you safe or are you not safe from radiant heat based on your household position? And that can run automatically across the landscape. It can look into various different fire weather scenarios. It can be calibrated to local fuel loads. That's also available in the R package. So this is just a quick example of us running that radiant heat calculation continuously across a part of the Hobart area. You can see the Wellington Range on the left there in red, obviously a very high radiant heat risk in the forests, going down through the rural urban interface and then into the blue areas, which are the deeper suburbs where there isn't much bushland around. So that's just a demonstration of how this can be run continuously over a suburban area. We ran it at the household scale. We'll talk about the aims of our work there. What we did was take the radiant heat model and the firebrand model, ran them for each house across the Hobart and Glenorchy local government areas here in southern Tasmania, and identified for each house, was it at hazard or not, based on that modelling. We then did some scenarios on top of that. We looked at what happens if we reduced fuel load in the surrounding vegetation. In this case, we reduced the assumed steady state fuel load to 50% of its maximum level. Those are the bars in blue here. And we also used the outputs of the initial hazard mapping to identify high risk areas, those houses on the interface which were at risk of ember or radiant heat impacts. Taking those houses, we then built in additional buffers of over 25 or 50 metres. We changed that interface, shifted it back. Now, I need to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean bare earth land clearing. This is about implementing some of the strategies that David was talking about as alternatives to that potentially, such as marsupial lawns or thinning. But we're saying, let's shift that interface back. Let's change it close to the high risk houses. In doing so, we can see where I've marked the 40% there. If we reduce or if we increase that buffer distance by 25 metres alongside fuel management, we have a reduction in houses under hazard by 40%. If we do a 50-metre interface modification, we get a 70% reduction in the houses under hazard. The code behind this house loss hazard framework is also available in that R package. You can load in local topographic vegetation housing information and run that to look at your local area and test scenarios. So this is just an example of what that interface modification might look like around some areas of Hobart. We have the 25 and 50 metre interface modification around the houses marked there, and across the Hobart local government area, the interfaces identified as being high-risk ones that could undergo modification. So I'll just quickly, my last summary of the tools, go through some of our social tools and our social policy recommendations. I'll just go through these. So some of the things we identified which should be considered in developing policy includes clarity around the place of last resort versus nearby safer place. People are confused about what these mean. They're not sure when they should go to these places. They're not sure what they will find when they go there. Will there be resources there for them, or is it really a truly emergency location? This, combined with the fact that there is consistent messaging under the new National Fire Danger Rating systems to leave early, means there is some confusion in the population about, does that mean I go to a nearby safer place? Does that mean I go to a place of last resort? What does it actually mean? So they need some clarity around there. We found that people need to understand the options of fuel treatment, and we need to understand people's preferences. There needs to be social license built for that. And one way we can do that is through demonstration. Take areas and show people what the different fuel treatment options look like, which will go into some of our future work we'll talk about in a minute. It's important to build community connections. People don't necessarily have the skills or the knowledge to implement the changes to their garden design, for example, which are necessary. Mentoring, community working bees, skill exchange are all options for building those skills and giving people the resources they need. It's also important that support is given in a practical way to people in reducing hazard. There are a number of options here: green waste collection, sharing of tools, grants and incentives for reducing hazards in houses and gardens, and targeted assistance for residents with physical limitations are all potential pathways to improving the ability of people to manage their properties and reduce that garden level risk. But we need to respect what people value. An important outcome from our discussions with homeowners is that people have values in their gardens. They love their gardens. They like what's there. Fire hazard reduction isn't the only value that needs to be taken into account. That needs to be balanced with other values that people perceive on their properties. It's also important to make expert knowledge accessible. We need to provide people with locally relevant information. We need to provide potentially custom information for their own property and their own garden. And some of the tools we've developed here enable that. Need to provide clear guides about what to do. Need to provide people with the ability to do self-assessments and understand the risk around them, and track the progress in the changes they're making. So this is a diagram David developed, highlighting what we need to adapt to the new wildfire reality. Research and development, education and demonstration, which is very important, and incentivisation and enforcement when we look at that hazard. And we'll just give some demonstrations of our ongoing work in the next 3 slides, which attempt to address some of these pillars. So one ongoing study, which was established in this NHRA project, but which is continuing, is in a site above my office here, above our office here at the University of Tasmania on the University Reserve, which is a dense casuarina and eucalypt woodland, very high fire risk. Prescribed burning is conducted there. It seems to have been thickening the vegetation over time rather than actually reducing risk. So we've got a number of trial plots up there testing alternative methods of fuel management, including mechanical thinning, monitoring those over time, looking at changes in the structure. That's a live experiment which is ongoing here on the University of Tasmania campus. A really important ongoing project we've got is a collaboration we've established with the local automobile and insurance company, RACT. We've got an experiment across the Hobart and Kingborough local government areas, which is just kicking off, which is focusing on interventions and incentivisations on private property, going to residents, seeing what the barriers to hazard reduction in their gardens are, testing different incentives, including provision of green waste removal, assessments, potential insurance incentives, and then going back and seeing which of those incentives made the most difference to reducing garden level risk, and including that LiDAR analysis in that to see if we can automate that process of identifying risk reduction as part of that experiment. An important outcome from this, which you'll be hopefully seeing soon, are the hazard notes we've produced from this project. We've got a couple on the geospatial outputs, we've got one on the biophysical outputs, and we've got one on the social outputs. So hopefully those, on top of our major report, will encapsulate some of the findings we've presented to you here today. I think that's all we've got, Ro. Thanks.
That's great. No, thank you, Grant. We'll pass over now to Melissa O'Halloran, one of our star end users, to talk about this project and the learnings.
Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to provide some of my reflections as an end user of this project. Firstly, a little bit about how the project came about, some of my observations throughout the project, and then I guess some of my sort of commitments to implementing this work in the future. So my recollection is this was always one of the first projects on the radar for NHRA when it was first established. It's a Tranche 2 project, and we're now up to 10 or 11. So yeah, definitely very early on in the project, and just recognising how important it was. So my interest in this came about because I led the building impact assessment during the 2019-2020 bushfire season in New South Wales. During that fire season, we surveyed over 40,000 structures, and sadly, we recorded 2,476 homes that were destroyed. And I guess part of my frustration is some of the communication that came after that was, the speculation about how this happened and about the patterns of loss. And, we heard phrases like, oh, the house loss is random and, it wasn't able to be explained. And that's simply not true. We know that it's a whole combination of things. We know that it's not a simple issue. And so in that sort of reactive phase of trying to seek answers, we just didn't have them. So we knew we needed a project that was going to look at the complexity, that wasn't going to look at this in a really isolated way. So historically, we've done a lot of case studies in this. Most fires, most of our significant fires have had case studies, and we've looked at sort of limited aspects of that, and we've looked at them in isolation. What was really needed was this significant investment in looking at this problem from all these different aspects. So even before the project was awarded, before the EOI went out, we had lots of end user workshops. There was a lot of interest in this. We set really high expectations, and through the EOI process, University of Tasmania was the successful applicant for this one. But that wasn't the end of the planning of this either. So huge shout out to Kat Haynes, who was the first NHRA project manager for this, because I think there was a lot of perseverance in bringing the end users and the project team together. We spent a lot of time working on that project plan, but I think every second of it was worth it, because it meant that we had a really strong common understanding of what we wanted this project to deliver. And certainly it has lived up to all those expectations. One of the things I really appreciated being a part of in that early part of the project was we looked at a lot of that historical research and literature that had been produced. And both Grant and David spoke to that. And we got to challenge a lot of the assumptions that were made in that. And this is where a lot of this work has built off the shoulders of that and has described a lot of the nuances that really are experienced in how we can identify what is going on in the rural-urban interface. I guess another lesson for me as part of being an end user for this project was I was initially quite disappointed about Hobart being selected as the main case study. Obviously, an end user would like it to be in their back garden, and we certainly have had some elements of it in New South Wales. But a lesson for me was that this was a really, data-rich environment. Grant talked about the availability of LiDAR, but there are a lot of other elements why this was a really good case study that we've actually been able to learn a lot from. Features that can't be replicated elsewhere. One of my sort of favourite moments of the project that talks to this was in our project management committee meeting in November 2024, and Sharon Campbell was talking about the social surveys, and that was one of the projects that was presented there. So they interviewed 15,000 residents about their wildfire risk perceptions. And what was really interesting and stuck with me, they had an overall survey response of 32%. So 32% of people picked up that phone and answered the survey, which is not something that could be replicated elsewhere. And these were some of the amazing sort of stories we learnt through this project, and understanding how these projects get put together and how complex they are. So you read all these papers and you just don't pick up a lot of this work. It's really hard to pick my favourite parts of this project. I'm thinking about one that I really am very keen to work on in the short term is probably that LiDAR garden assessment, because I can see a real vision for how that's can help what we're doing in terms of bushfire management. So the work of both Stefania Undia and Owen Price in this, and they've worked very well in the two different sort of case study areas. So we do have good LiDAR data in other parts of the state and other parts of the country. And so we're really keen to see this, because it won't replace what we do on the ground, having those conversations, but will help us triage that information to be able to pick where we need to go and prioritise this work. So we can look at streets to suburb scale of work rather than individual properties. So there's a lot of work that it can do to help us in how we prioritise our key communities and where we need to focus our work. I can see a point not too far in the future where we would be acquiring new LiDAR information ahead of the fire season, perhaps this round time of year, and we would look at where we think we need to prioritise those on the ground works. And then possibly we go back and we refly it again and we see whether we've actually made any change to the behaviour, to see whether people are actually picking that up and are making those changes to their gardens. while we've done a lot of this reflective work and looking at some of the historical fires, I think one of the really key parts of this project was that forward facing. What are the things that we can do about it? It was really important that we've done that because a lot of work has been very reflective. Another shout out to Anna Jedram and a lot of that work in that looking at the breaking down the barriers about preparedness and what that means for individuals, because quite often we will send a message and it's really hard for us to understand. We've told you what the answer is, but knowing about that connection to place, knowing about what skills people need to be able to do that, it's been really important for us. So this has been a great part of that. Now, as climate change drives more intense fires in a lot of locations, we need more tools in this toolkit. We've done a lot of work as fire managers in terms of our suppression effectiveness. We've got more aircraft, we're pre-positioning dispatch, we're looking at early detection. But there's going to, at some point, be a limit to the cost effectiveness of our improving in that space. And I think this project sets us up for where we're going to be able to make the biggest changes in the coming years. So we spent a lot of time on the planning, and we've got an amazing amount of work and a huge volume that's been delivered throughout the project. Well, what are we going to do about it? And we have already been using this as the project's been going. So David mentioned the work on the distance of bushfire, so distance to the vegetation. So our planning for bushfire protection and our bushfire-prone land is based off that, nominally 100 metres. And the work that Owen did in some of the New South Wales communities helped us in our current sort of revision of that policy. We had actually had a couple of places where we were revising those maps in consultation with the local government, but it helped us to validate the work that we're doing, and has given us some really good ideas about what we can do to make that more nuanced and more developed in future. So our next thing we've got to do is we've got to start testing and trialling things, taking all those sort of R packages from Grant and the other tools and to build some more case studies. There's a lot of work to do. I'm really fortunate that I've had the opportunity to sort of promote this work within my organisation, and I guess the commitment for us is that we've just released our new strategic directions, and we've actually put this in place in 2 different parts of our plan. So this is our 2026 to 2031 strategic directions, and we've got, from the community side, we've got a direction where we're going to support communities to develop personalised plans informed by local risk. And then on the other on our side, we've got enhancing community awareness and engagement in bushfire risk mitigation initiatives. So I guess taking what we've learned from this project and that whole multifaceted approach, and we've embedded that in our strategic directions. So I'm hoping that in the next 5 years, I'll have the privilege to implement a lot of this work. I just want to congratulate Ro in particular for being the project manager for this. She's been such a strong champion for it, and also to the University of Tasmania team for such a productive and effective project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mel. Brilliant. And thank you to Dave and Grant. I'd now like to open it to the Q&A panel. You can put your questions into the Q&A because we've had 3 fascinating presentations. There's been details for everyone. It's been a fantastic journey for everybody who's been involved, but you guys are also part of this journey. So I do have 3 questions, but keep them coming. Put them in the Q&A. You'll find the little icon down the bottom of your screen. But coming from Angus Barbary, he said, great talks, everyone. A question for David or Grant. Did you assess the relationship between garden tree canopy cover density and house loss? If so, what did you find?
Look, I think that's part of the work in particular that Owen Price continues to focus on. He's really focused on building those empirical models of house loss, looking at both Australian and United States cases. I don't have his actual results unless you know, David, regarding that specific question, but yeah, we're looking at that.
No, that's exactly right. So one of the problems of the global guidelines is that, and this is why applied research is so interesting, is that practitioners and experts are smart people and they formulate solutions to problems, but they don't necessarily map it out as a scientific question. And so there's a lot of the evidence steps are missing. And you might say, well, that doesn't matter, but it does matter because you can't innovate if you haven't got a complete explanation of what's going on. So to a certain degree, what we need to do urgently is a retrospective analysis, deeper analysis of the risk factors in gardens of known house loss rather than inferred hazard, because a lot of what we're doing is it's like we're assuming that it's dangerous, but we really need to tie down those exact questions. And just so happens that the timing with the LiDAR revolution that's occurring and the explosion of fires means we've got really a rich body of data that we can mine, but we need to be funded and tasked to really dig into that properly.
Thank you for that one. Got Chantel O'Brien is asking, who are you aiming your education at? Are there different resources for homeowners, tenants versus the media?
So I want to talk to that. So part of the problem of this project is that this is just a segment of a larger thing. I have the vision thing, I talked about. I'm not going away. We have to solve this problem, right? I think about this problem every day. I live in this problem. Hobart is at great risk. So what we need to do is to figure out how we disseminate the information. We need to have different channels and different customized to different audiences. So the hazard notes from the natural hazards point of view is something that is a really important step. What we are going to do with the hazard notes, we want to make a little YouTube taster where we help people engage with a hazard note, because some people might find that level of reading a bit insurmountable. So having some guidance, some on-ramps and off-ramps will be useful. We have a Living with Fire course. We want to develop some other courses, some other materials. So look, it's basically a constant process of communications. It's not one thing, it's lots of things. And again, we will do as much as we can within the resources we've got made available, but shake the cage, tell people that communications are important, demand better communications. It's part of the shared responsibility step, is that we've got to spread the word. We're in a really serious place, so we need lots of really high quality evidence. So what's terrifying is the social media AI sort of fantastical stuff, which we can go off a precipice. So having high quality badged accessible information is super important.
Thanks, David. Easy one for you, Grant. Where do we get the fire kit package?
I've just posted the link in the chat, and also if you scan the QR code attached with that slide, and I presume we make the slide deck available, that will also link to the preprint on that, which has a link. We are gradually at the Fire Centre putting various tools into that fire kit package. My Ember and Radiant Heat models are in there. The LiDAR analysis code will be in there soon, I believe, once we work that out with Steph. So that will be where we encapsulate all the tools we produce going forward.
Great, thank you. Barbara says, exciting work, team, thanks. Can you see your tools being packaged into a simple to use tool for us working in community engagement? Just wondering about acceptance of this approach, privacy, etc.
Yeah, I mean, David might want to speak to this too, but as I highlighted, we are trying to get that assessment methodology made available to the public in various other apps. One of the limitations with this sort of funded research is that our primary job is researchers. We produce research, we produce outputs like that. We don't have the scope or the funding to then launch and maintain an app or anything like that. That's sort of the next step which has to be carried forward, and we're always very, very happy to talk to people who want to make use of our research and help them build that sort of real world application of these kinds of tools. But yes, we are looking into options there.
That's great. And you're getting a few other questions about how to access the apps and the tools. One's from Mark, one of the volunteer fire brigade captains. I'm going to take you to a question from Mel Taylor. Do you have any insights into how community members felt about being identified as having a high risk garden property? Just wondering about acceptance of this approach.
So all of the social science work that we've done was done with the University of Tasmania social science ethics. So people were de-identified, privacy, and so on. So we have to be very careful about those matters. There is going to be some really interesting thinking, I suppose, now that we're developing the technologies, and others will be likewise, where we can use remote sensing, high quality remote sensing, to identify property risk. And that comes down to really important incentives and penalties. We've got to be really careful about this. The thing that shocked me, certainly about attitudes towards fuel management, is that project was not about political orientation. We were expecting gender or socioeconomic. The only thing that came out was political orientation. It was a surprise to us, very unexpected. So what we have to be careful of is not treading on the death adders. That the problem is that there are all these threats, and if you breach trust or go in too hard, the repair bill will be very great. That you can imagine, the conspiracy theory that there's this cabal of insurers who are going to penalise you. There's all of these things. So we've got to be super careful thinking through this and getting that fuel mix of incentives and penalties right. Because if you get it wrong at the beginning, you may never actually recover. You will be in this, going down this, slippery slope of distrust or fear, culture wars, whatever. So we've got to be very, very careful. And I think that's where, wise social scientists, ethnographers who can think through how communities think and how to think about messaging. Don't just leave it to the researchers to, because there's a whole sets of skills. We know this, what happened with COVID and so on. We've got to be very, very careful. That would be my, very serious concern, that it's exciting, but we've got to hasten slowly in some of these matters, or it could blow up in our face like tobacco has, and all the vaccines and everything. We've just got to be super careful.
No, it's a good point, Dave. We've got to build that trust on the rural-urban interface. And on that topic, we have more questions than we have time to answer today, but our team will try and answer and send you emails outside of this session. I would particularly like to thank Dave, Grant, and Melissa for taking the time to share this work and answering the questions they've got to so far. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us online for submitting the questions to the panel. The recording of this webinar will be online in the next week or so you'll all receive an email with the link alongside information about our upcoming hazardous webinars. For updates on everything Natural Hazard Research Australia, sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Again, thank you to our presenters who did a fantastic job. We'll see you all next time. Thank you.